One of the many difficult and perplexing questions in reading the Bible, if you read the story of the Bible, and especially if you read the story of the Old Testament, is found in Exodus. And the basic story of the Exodus goes as follows. God sends Moses to Pharaoh with a simple message. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. Well, Pharaoh, as my children will tell you, said what to this request? He said no. That's right. Yeah. And God sends a series of plagues on the Egyptians, and 10 total. And at some point, Pharaoh finally is motivated by all of these plagues. After his firstborn son dies, he is finally motivated to let the people leave Egypt. In fact, what we have to notice is that if we read the whole story of the Exodus, Pharaoh really kind of waffles back and forth as to whether or not he's going to let the people go. And first, he tells them, okay, I'm convinced these plagues are just so terrible. Why don't you just worship in the land? You can worship your God here. And, well, that's not good enough. And so he says, well, you can leave, but don't go far. But no, that's not good enough either. He says, well, you can leave the land, but you have to leave your women and children behind you. Chapter 10, and verses 8 through 11. And eventually, he says, well, you can take the women and children, but you have to leave your stuff. And that's in chapter 10 and verse 24. Finally, he just says, just leave already. Just go away. I've had enough of you in the land. We're going to drive you out. And so not only did Pharaoh let the people go, he practically forced them to leave after all of the horrible things that had happened. And you just wonder, well, Pharaoh, if you just let the people go right away, all of this could have been avoided. But in fact, if we read the book of Exodus, we are informed in advance that that was not what would happen. In Exodus chapter 4, in verses 21 through 23, the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart, so that he will not let the people go. Thus you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. This is an example of equal retribution in the Bible. Pharaoh refuses to let God's son go, so God in response punishes his son. But amidst all of that, in verse 21, we have the statement the Lord makes that He will harden the heart of Pharaoh and prevent him from letting the people go until a certain point. And then in chapter 7, we have a similar statement. In chapter 7, in verses 1 through 5, the Lord said to Moses, see, I make you as God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh, that he let the sons of Israel go out of the land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh does not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. In both of these passages, the Lord says the same thing. I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And that kind of raises some uncomfortable questions for people. Did God make Pharaoh behave in the stubborn way that he did? Did God force him to do this? It seems like God almost acts a little counter towards his own purposes, we might think. God, on the one hand, tells Pharaoh to let the people go, but on the other hand, hardens his heart so he won't do it. And so this raises the great question for the ages. Did God make Pharaoh do it? Or did Pharaoh choose to do this on his own and God merely paved the way for his stubborn inclinations? This question is, in some ways, the big parting of the ways for the debate about, God's sovereignty versus man's free will. And really, I don't think those two things are incompatible. God truly is sovereign over all the universe, and He truly has given man a choice, at least in regards to the question of whether or not man can serve Him. But really, when you read the Bible, there are three sets of passages that we might look at. And the first set of passages says that, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. The second set of passages says that Pharaoh's heart was hard. Doesn't specify anybody doing it. And the third set of passages says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And you will find all three of these in the Exodus story, if you read closely enough. I'll give you some examples. We've already read some examples of the Lord saying He's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. The first time in the Exodus story that God actually does this is in chapter 9 in verse 12 after the plague of boils. It says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart and he did not listen to them, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses. Another passage is after the plague of, during the plague of locusts, right before the plague of locusts, the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may perform these signs of mine among them." In verse 20, after the plague of locusts, it says, "The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the sons of Israel go." In verse 27, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. In chapter 11, in verse 10, Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, yet the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the sons of Israel go out of his land. And we could point to a few other examples of this, but it is clear, if we say God hardened Pharaoh's heart, that is a biblical statement. We cannot deny that, because to deny it would be to deny the text. Secondly, we'll point to the other set of passages. In chapter 7 in verse 13, it says, "Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said." That's after Aaron's rod became a serpent, and the magicians turned their rods into serpents too, because, look at us, we're so cool, we can do the same miracle you do. And Aaron's snake ate their snakes, which they apparently couldn't do. But it says on that occasion that Pharaoh's heart was hard. It doesn't tell us who hardened it. It just says his heart was hardened. And in verse 14, the Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. Pharaoh's heart is hard. He refuses to let the people go." In verse 22, after the water is turned to blood, it says that the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. Another instance in chapter 8 and verse 19, the magicians told Pharaoh after a plague of insects or gnats or lice or however you translate it, after that plague came on the land, the magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He did not listen to them as the Lord had said. I should probably mention in passing, this expression that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, this is an idiomatic Hebrew way of simply saying that he was being stubborn. It doesn't mean that Pharaoh had this muscle in his chest pumping blood that suddenly turned into titanium alloy or something. That's not what hardened heart means. A hardened heart means that he was made stubborn. In one instance, God made him stubborn. In another instance, it simply says he was stubborn. But then there's those few texts where it says that Pharaoh himself hardened his heart. Perhaps the most striking example of this is after the plague of the frogs. When God sends the second plague on the land, that the frogs come and they jump on the people and they go everywhere. And then the magicians show up and they do the same thing by their secret arts. I always have this weird fantasy about how that conversation must have gone down. Pharaoh, we've successfully duplicated the miracle. What? Well, why? Well, now there's more frogs than before. But weren't you supposed to be getting rid of the frogs? But Pharaoh, we've proven that they're not special anymore. Yeah, but you didn't get rid of the frogs. You didn't fix anything. Therein lies the real problem. Well, and so on that occasion, Pharaoh, apparently unsatisfied with the magicians, goes and consults Moses and Aaron. And he says, "Oh, beg the Lord for me, that he might remove the frogs from me and my people. And I will let the people go, and they will sacrifice the Lord." Pharaoh says, "I'm going to let them go." This is on the second plague now. Just pray for the Lord on my behalf, intercede, make the frogs go away. And Moses says, "All right." He says, and they set a date, the frogs will go away tomorrow, which, wonder why wouldn't he send the frogs away today? But the frogs will depart from you and your houses and your servants and your people, and they will be left only in the Nile. And so Moses intercedes on Pharaoh's behalf. He prays to God, and the frogs go away. And in verse 15, when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not listen to them as the Lord had said. Again in verse 32, after the plague of flies, Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also, and he did not let the people go. In chapter 9, in verse 34, after the plague of hail, when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned again and hardened his heart, he and his servants. Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not let the sons of Israel go, just as the Lord had spoken through Moses. That's an example of both of these, by the way. Pharaoh hardened his heart was hardened. Chapter 9, verses 34 and 35. In chapter 9 and verse 17, we have a similar expression that Pharaoh exalted himself. Still you exalt yourself against my people by not letting them go. Now what does all this mean? Did the Lord make Pharaoh do it? Or did Pharaoh do it himself? Well, both are stated in the text. And so, on some level, we have to answer the question, yes. Both are true. And there really isn't a conflict between those statements. Now, some people might break in and say, well, it looks like there's a conflict between those. You know, God makes somebody do something. What possible resistance could they have to that? Well, you know, and that's not really... Well, but I think we're asking the wrong question in some ways. In fact, Paul seems to make that point very much in Romans chapter 9. In Romans chapter 9, somebody asks... Here, I'll just read this passage here. In Romans chapter 9, after describing Pharaoh and the situation of his heart being hardened and saying he has mercy on whom he desires and he hardens whom he desires, in verse 19, you will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who resists his will? I mean, you know, we're not really accountable if God makes us do stuff, does he? On the contrary, verse 20, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? The thing molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me like this, will it? Or does not the potter have a right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for honorable use, another for common use? What if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, and did so to make the riches of his glory known upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory? Now, all of that said, you know, Paul's basic answer to this question is, you don't have the right to ask that question. Sometimes we say there are no dumb questions or whatnot. Paul apparently thought there were dumb questions because he occasionally answers them in such a way or derisive fashion. He says, why does he still find fault? But resist his will. On the contrary, why are you answering back to God? Why are you asking this question? Paul doesn't really engage in their philosophical discussion of, free will versus sovereignty. And what he does here is he basically explains God's in charge of the situation. You don't have the right to really question him. Now, what is free will? Does man have it? Well, you won't find a verse in the Bible that says mankind has the ability to choose things. You don't see that verse anywhere. I think we can agree on that. And nevertheless, it is a reality that is assumed by certain texts. Deuteronomy chapter 30 in verses 19 and 20, for instance, he says that I've set before you this day the blessing and the curse, life and death. So choose life in order that you may live. Well, how's man going to choose life if he doesn't have a choice? Well, there's a question to consider. Joshua 24 verse 15, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods that your fathers served beyond the river or the gods of the Canaanites in the land you're living in right now. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's a great thing to say, Joshua. But in order to even make that statement of choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, you have to first assume that man has the ability to choose. We see over and over again in the Scriptures how people are exhorted to choose God's instruction, like Mary, who chose the better part that would not be taken away from her in Luke 10:42. We read in Hebrews 11:25 of those heroes of faith that chose ill treatment with God's people over the passing pleasures of this world. And specifically, Moses is the one who is being spoken of there. And we learn, of course, that the Bible does not argue for free will where people can choose good and evil. It simply assumes it. In Isaiah chapter 7, Isaiah mentions a son that will be born named Emmanuel. And just in passing, he says, before this child, Isaiah 7 14, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel. He will eat curds and honey at the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. There's an assumption there that, children are able to choose, that children, when they get to a certain age, are able to choose between good and evil. That's the assumption in that text. And again in verse 16, before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread shall be forsaken. And that idea is put forth again. On top of all of that, even if we didn't have all these passages that argue for free will, we still have to deal with the fact that, what reason is there for revelation in the first place? Mankind can't choose to serve God or not serve God. Why have the Bible? Why have God talking to you? Why have any of this? What business does it matter? God's just going to pre-program you to act a certain way? Well, the truth is that mankind does have some say in the matter. The Lord has been extending His love and His compassion to mankind since the beginning. And He's given man the simple choice to reciprocate that relationship or not. The question becomes whether man will reciprocate or not. But in reality, how much free will do we really have? Well, we shouldn't be so arrogant to think that we are totally in control of our own destiny. That we, and we alone, have the final say in what's going to happen to us. Well, really, we only make one choice. The only choice we make is, will we serve God or will we serve Satan? Will we serve self, the world? And all other choices stem off of that one. Now, theoretically, we could change that choice at any time. We could be serving Satan and then make a decision somewhere along the way that, I need to change my life and get my life right. I'm going to go serve the Lord. And we've changed something about ourselves. On the other hand, we could be off serving the Lord, making all the right decisions, and then Satan could come and delude us with persuasive argument, and suddenly we go, you know what? I'm done with this. I'm tired of living for others. I'm going to live for myself, and we're going to go serve self now. We're going to go serve Satan. People can change that choice at any time, but that is the main choice they make. The main choice that we all make. Are we going to serve God, or are we going to serve Satan? But Pharaoh made a choice. Pharaoh made a choice very early on in the story not to serve the Lord. And when he made that choice, the Lord hardened his heart. He hardened his own heart. And you'll notice there's actually a progression in the story if you read it. Because, at first it's just Pharaoh's heart was hard. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. But at some point you get to plague 6. That's the first time that the text actually says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And Pharaoh hardens his own heart again at plague 7. But then plagues 8 and 9 and 10. The Lord's doing the hardening now. At some point, Pharaoh gets himself so caught up in this cyclical refusal to obey the Lord, to submit to the Lord, to serve the Lord, that he passes a point of no return. He passes a point where he is no longer able to serve the Lord because he is so stubbornly rooted in his own ideal. And just as it is unthinkable that some people would stop serving the Lord because they're so entrenched in serving the Lord, it became unthinkable that Pharaoh would start serving the Lord because he had become so entrenched in serving himself. You think about that. You all know someone like that we all know someone who the idea of them falling away is just totally unthinkable. It's not completely, ontologically impossible, but it's unthinkable that they would do it because they're so devoted to Him and they love Him so much. Why would they abandon the Lord? And so in that sense, the Lord has so softened their heart that they're not going to choose to follow Him. The opposite is true as well. There are some people that are just so deadly entrenched in their ways, so deadly entrenched in living for themselves that they're not going to budge. They're not going to change. They're not going to be different. We can pray that something will happen to shake them out of that stubbornness, that something will happen to shake them out of that and give them a change of heart. But the reality is that there are those who are hardened of heart and there are those who are not. Those who are softened of heart. And Pharaoh makes the decision in chapter 5 when Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey His voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord. Besides, I will not let Israel go." You see that kind of language there, that kind of talk? I don't know who God is. I don't care what He says. I'm going to do what I want. That right there, his heart was already hardened at the beginning of the discussion, was it not? And everything that happened further served to be self-validating evidence for his position. Even when confronted with evidence to the total contrary. The land of Egypt was totally destroyed, and still Pharaoh was determined to cling to his stubborn, I will not let the people go. I am in charge in my world. I call the shots in my world. That's the kind of thinking that Pharaoh has. Pharaoh probably believed in free will, in a much more dramatic sense than we've been talking about tonight. And yet, really, what do we learn here? You see that Pharaoh is the one who, he thinks he's the boss. He thinks he's in charge of his own existence. And really, Pharaoh's not in charge in Egypt even. He's not really the king of Egypt. He has to answer to the king of all the earth, and the judge of all the earth. The other thing I would notice, and this is interesting to note in and of itself, is some people will point to the fact that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and they'll say, well, that's just not fair. God's being cruel. He's sticking Pharaoh in an unwinnable situation, right? But the truth is that God makes two announcements about what He's planning to do, and then He goes on to state what His real purpose is. In chapter 7 and verse 3, He says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. And in verse 5 he says, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. There's a bigger plan involved here. It's not just God getting stubborn little Pharaoh to do what he wants. It's God making His glory known to all the nation of Egypt. And you think about how remarkable that is, that in a nation of pagan Egyptians will be forced to not only acknowledge the existence of Yahweh, but acknowledge His supremacy over them and over all their gods. Again, in chapter 11, in verses 9 and 10, the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that my wonders will be multiplied in the land of Egypt. Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, and yet the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the sons of Israel go out of his land. God showed him all of these glorious things. Well, what would have happened if God had just destroyed Pharaoh after the first plague? After the first no even. They come in, Pharaoh says, I'm not letting the people go. And God says, oh yes you are. Zaps him with a bolt of lightning, which he could have done because he's God. And boom, all the people can escape from Egypt just fine. God could have done that if He wanted to, but He chose not to. God doesn't always feel the need to operate on our instantaneous timetable. God doesn't always feel the need to perform every task immediately the way we think He might want to. Instead, what happens? He chooses to let Pharaoh last longer. He chooses to let Pharaoh live a little bit past that point to further demonstrate his power. The fact that Pharaoh even exists after his first refusal is proof of God's grace. It is a demonstration of His temporal mercy before He completes His judgment. And even during the plagues themselves, God shows mercy to Pharaoh. Think about it. Pharaoh makes all these false promises. He makes a request for supplication over the frogs, which we already looked at. He makes a false promise, oh, make the flies go away and I'll let you go. No, that didn't happen. He confesses sin whenever the hail comes down and destroys everything. He confesses, I've sinned, I'll let the people go now, just make it go away. But he doesn't keep that promise either. And the same thing happened with the locusts in chapter 10 in verses 16 through 20. Pharaoh makes all these false promises, just make the plague go away and I'll let the people go. And he never keeps any of them until the last plague happens. And you know what's crazy about all that? God actually listens to Pharaoh's requests. God actually takes the frogs away. He takes the hail away. He takes the locusts away. He honors Moses' intercessions. And Pharaoh never held up his end of the deal. You might think Pharaoh might even be sitting in his throne room congratulating himself after that scene and going, oh boy, I'm sure smart. I hoodwinked God into getting the plagues to go away. Nobody hoodwinks God. Really, God is masterminding the whole situation. He knows full well what Pharaoh's up to. He lets him have his little victory. He lets him have his little concession over here. He lets him have his little, you play with that for a little bit and see how that goes. It's really not much different, by the way, than the reason that God allows Satan to continue to exist. You think about it. Satan is doomed to destruction, just like Pharaoh was doomed to destruction. I hadn't really ever thought of Satan as Pharaoh as an analogy for Satan before, but there's something to that. There's a sense in which Pharaoh was doomed to destruction, but God permits him to remain just a little longer, to continue demonstrating His glory. He continues to let him oppress the people just a little bit longer, to continue showing His glory. There's no way that this guy is ever going to convert, but the Lord has a purpose nonetheless in allowing him to remain. A purpose somewhat probably beyond the grasp of Israel, beyond the grasp of Moses, beyond even our grasp. But a purpose nonetheless. To demonstrate His glory and to demonstrate His mercy in a very temporary sense. God allows the magicians, He allows the court officials, as their voices enter into this scenario, they try to persuade Pharaoh. They try to talk him out of this. Let the people go. Egypt is ruined. No, that didn't work. He had been given sufficient evidence to see that God would keep His word, but he maintained his stubbornness. There's a lot of other passages that talk about God hardening people's hearts in the Old Testament, like in the case of Sihon in Deuteronomy 2, or in the case of the Canaanites in Joshua 11. But I want to look at what the New Testament says about this. There are two occasions in the Gospels where Jesus' disciples are accused of having hardened hearts. Both of them are in Mark. Mark chapter 6 mentions that they had been hardened of heart and they had not learned anything from the incident of the loaves. That's why they were getting all panicky whenever the storm was coming up on the Sea of Galilee. And in Mark chapter 8 and verse 17, Jesus asked them, do you still have a hardened heart? After all the things you've seen, after all the miracles you've witnessed? In 2 Corinthians 3, it talks about those who hear the law, but they haven't accepted Christ, and their hearts are hardened. They have a veil lying over their hearts. They listen to the Scriptures, but the Scriptures do not change them. In Hebrews chapter 3, of course, believers are warned, take care that there not be in you an evil, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. And quoting from Psalm 95, he warns them in the language of the Exodus, today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me, as in the day of trial in the wilderness. Hebrews chapter 3 and verses 7 and 8. But perhaps and another text I think is important. I almost said most important, but I've got one more. John chapter 12 and verse 36. The second part of verse 36. These things Jesus spoke, and He went away and hid Himself from them. But though He had performed so many signs before them, yet they were not believing in Him. This was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet, which he spoke, Lord, who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For this reason they could not believe. For Isaiah said again, He has blinded their eyes, and He hardened their heart, so that they would not see with their eyes, and perceive with their heart, and be converted, and I heal them. These things Isaiah said because he saw His glory, and he spoke of Him. Nevertheless, many even of the rulers believed in Him, but because of the Pharisees, they were not confessing Him, for the fear that they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God. I find it interesting how John takes the language of the Exodus and uses it to describe why the Jews of that day rejected Jesus. Like Pharaoh and the Egyptians before them, they saw so many signs and so many wonders, and they refused to believe. They refused to be changed. And why? And even people that saw Jesus and said, well, yeah, I concede, you know what? Jesus probably knows what He's talking about, but I'm still not going to change. Why? Because they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God. Isn't that really the problem today? I would suggest that this is part of the reason why Pharaoh hardened his heart. And why his heart got so hardened. Why he got so stubborn. There's few things more psychologically difficult than admitting that you're wrong about something. And there's few things more psychologically difficult for the guy who's the king of Egypt, one of the most powerful people in the known world at that time, humbling himself and admitting that, oh, wait, I'm not really in charge. Maybe I was wrong about this. Maybe I'm not the greatest person in the universe after all. There are so few things in the world for a man of that power and position There are so few things more difficult than for that man in power and position to admit he is not in charge of his world. He is not in charge of what's going on. How many of us really have the same issue? I mean, who likes to admit that they're wrong? I don't. I don't enjoy that. But the gospel is in large part about admitting that yes, you are wrong about something in your life. You are wrong about the way you've lived your life. And you need to change. Now you can choose to continue living your life the same way that you've always lived it. I'm a good enough person as I am. You can say that. I don't need to change anything for anybody. You can say that. But that's the words of a person whose heart is hardened. Those are the words of a person who loves the approval of men, who loves and who hates the idea of being caught in a wrongness situation. That's a person who is embarrassed by their own shortcomings. Really, whose approval should you be seeking? You should be seeking God's approval. That's the basic point we need to make here. Choose the approval of God over the approval of men. Because God's opinion of you is really the only one that matters. I mean, your next door neighbor's opinion of you doesn't matter. My opinion of you doesn't matter. The opinions of men don't matter. But God's opinion does matter. And so you should be worried about what He thinks of you more than anything else. And finally, looking at Romans chapter 9 again, it was noted that God could have destroyed Pharaoh at any time. In verse 14, Paul writes, "What shall we say? There is no injustice with God, is there? May it never be." He says to Moses, "I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion." So then it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. But the Scripture says to Pharaoh, "For this very purpose I raised you up, to demonstrate my power in you, that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth." That's it right there. God, it was inconsequential to God's purpose whether Pharaoh converted or not. The point was to make His name known throughout the whole earth, to give God a greater recognition, the recognition He deserves. So then He has mercy on whom He desires, and He hardens whom He desires. God could have destroyed Pharaoh the first time, and God would have been fully within His right to do so, and fully within His power, and fully within His authority, but He chose to keep Pharaoh alive, and raised him to a temporarily exalted position in order to demonstrate His glory. And even though Pharaoh was shown the grace of God in a sense, even though Pharaoh was allowed to remain on his throne, the judgment of God finally came on him, swift and without mercy. But really, who is this story really about? Well, it's about you. And you need to ask yourself a very simple question. As we come to the conclusion of this lesson tonight, as we reflect on the things above, there's a sense in which you only have one choice. Will you serve God, or will you serve yourself? Will you submit to the rule of God in your life, or will you continue to think that you're the ruler in your life? Will you believe the lie of the devil that you are the one who's in charge, that you can make your own choices? Or will you insist? And will you insist that you are the master of your existence? Or will you humbly submit yourself to the God of heaven, the ruler of Zion, who rules in the kingdoms of men? If there's something we can do to help you make your life right with the Lord, let it be known tonight while together we stand and we sing.